Welcome to this ChessGuin opening lesson. In this video, we are starting the King's Indian repertoire by looking at White's quieter setups and early sidelines. First, let's look at two setups with g3 where White doesn't play c4. d5 is, of course, also a good option, but we can try to stick with the King's Indian setup. If White plays c4 now, it will go into the variation we'll be looking at soon. Two interesting sidelines could be knight to c3 and b3. White's plan is to play e4. It's probably worth playing d5 now to prevent e4. It might seem like a loss of tempo, but White's knight isn't really well placed on c3, and this way White can't play c4. The main continuation is rook to e1, and White will still try to push e4. With other plans, we can usually just continue with c6 and knight to e4. At this point, e4 really can't be stopped, since after bishop to f5, knight comes to h4. In the next move, we're preparing for the position after exchanges on e4. The knight will support the c5 move from a6. Black's position is fine. We'll have good pieces and counterplay. With b3, instead of knight to c3, White tries to play a double fianchetto system. We can play double fianchetto too, and on top of that, there's also the option for a more active b5 instead of b6. The advantage of the b5 pawn is that we can capture on c4, but White should still consider moving it anyway. If White tries to play e4 with rook e1, we get counterplay again with c5. Main move is c4. We take it. After b-pawn takes c4, we simply continue with knight e4. Let's exchange White's strong bishop. And Black has no problem in this position. If they take on c4 with a knight, we still want to play c5, but we can play two useful moves before that. a4 could be a threat in some cases. An immediate c5 would also be a good move, but this unusual rook on a6 could be useful beforehand, whose goal is to give the queen space on a8. I really like Black's position. Queen can come to a8, c-pawn takes d4, knight to e4 and then a4 too. The plans are more concrete with Black than with White. Let's go back to White's main move, c4. White's main plan against the King's Indian is knight to c3 and then e4 to take control of the center. In this video, we'll look at the variations where e4 doesn't come immediately or only comes later. We'll also check out cases where the knight to c3 move is delayed. Let's check the fianchetto setup. Black can choose between some options, but I recommend the usual d6. However, afterwards it won't be the typical e5 plan that comes up, but with c5 we'll get a Benoni structure, like in many other variations in the repertoire later on. White can take the c5, or the more interesting line is to push d5. Now knight c3 would be a transposition to the third knight c3 line. Knight to e5 could be an alternative. This line will end with an equal position, for example, knight to d7, and both sides go for the c-pawns. Let's check the critical move, d5. We can continue the Benoni setup with e6, but in this case, we can play in Benko gambit style with b5, since White didn't play knight c3 to protect the b5 square. We take on a6 with the knight because the bishop will go to f5. Black has good compensation for the pawn. The knights can go to e4 and b4, and will attack on the a and b files. The detailed continuations can be found in the PGN. As I mentioned, knight c3 is the main continuation. Besides e4, White can start with knight to f3 or g3, which, by switching the move order, would be the same as knight to f3. And another interesting move is h4. Against h4, it's worth noting that we generally don't defend with h5, because the g5 point gets weak. Instead, we start counterplay in the center with c5. White wants to keep the center closed. Now we play like in the Benoni and try to open the center. Bishop e2 support the h5 push. We take on d5, and white can choose between e pawn takes d5 and c pawn takes d5. After c pawn takes d5, we attack the e4 pawn with queen e7. h5 finally arrives, and we don't let white to play h6, so we the on h5. The pawn structure doesn't look good, but this way we might have a chance to attack on the g file after castling long, and we have a really strong bishop on g7. The other option is e pawn takes d5. We develop the knight and want to occupy the e5 square in the future. h5 is the critical move. We take it again and aren't afraid of the pawn structure. White can force the queen exchange. We have a very strong bishop on g7 again, and our knight will jump to e5. After h4, let's see the developing knight f3 move. White has a few options here besides e4. He can play h4 again, develop the bishop to f4 or g5, and with g3 he can choose the fianchetto setup again. h4 is met by c5 again. We continue with e6 just like in the fourth h4 line. White can choose again. We attack the e4 pawn. Knight to d7, and then e5 is also a possible continuation for black, but I'll show another interesting alternative. b5, Benko-style again. On the b file we're planning to gain some counterplay, which fits well with our bishop on g7. Black has a pretty good compensation for the pawn, and the h4 pawn is more of a weakness than a threat right now. I think a pawn takes d5 is less complicated. We just bring the rook to the open file and continue with developing our bishop to g4 or f5. We'll control the e5 and have the b5 plan. Bishop f4 is followed by the usual d6 move. White can play e3 or give space on h2 for the bishop first. Black could even play for e5, but in many cases I prefer c5 for a more active game. After d5, we choose the Benko move again. Knight takes b5 is a mistake. We get the e4 square for our knight. We just defend the knight and have a really good compensation with threats like knight a6, then b4, or g5 move. Bishop f5 could have been a mistake because white can attack it with g4. If the pawn takes on b5, we continue with a6. And again, a very good Benko position has developed where we can play on the queen's side. Instead of d5, e3 is also possible with a more solid continuation for white. Since the bishop is not on c1 anymore, we can attack the b2 pawn with queen b6. f5 is a good place for the bishop. The knight will jump to e4. This is a convenient position where we can play for e5, even at the cost of a pawn sacrifice. If white skips the h3 move, we can start chasing the bishop with the knight to h5. After seeing Benoni and Benko setups, now comes a move reminiscent of the Dutch defense. c5 is still on the agenda, and g5 could also be a dangerous attack. Knight d2 would have been met by c5. We can play g5 now. After bishop g3, we continue with e6 and then c5. Better move is to counterattack the knight with knight d2. Queen e8, just like in the Dutch. We can play for e5 and c5 too, and castle is risky for white with these g5, f5 pawns. I think bishop g5 is a better approach than bishop f4. Usual d6. e4 is a transposition to one of the main lines. Other option is e3 or queen d2. c5 again. And b5 is a good move again since white hasn't developed very ideally. He can't really take with knight because our knight will get the e4 square and take the bishop. It looks like white handles the problems pretty well, but here comes a forced line where neither side can make a mistake. With knight takes on e4, we divert their knight from c3. We win back the piece and get 2 rooks for the queen. The complications doesn't end yet. White can take on e7. The bishop is pinned due to the knight on e4, so he protects it. f6 is a threat now. After knight takes on d6, we have the nice bishop f6 using the pin on the bishop. White should give back the queen. After the complications, the line ends with an equal position according to the engine, but I prefer black here. Let's get back to the e3 move instead of queen d2. We can start with h6. And c5 again. The continuation will be similar to the fifth bishop f4 line. If white advanced d5, we answer with g5, knight h5, and f5. g5 comes anyway. Now white has the option to take on c5, and if we take back, he could play bishop e5. We take the bishop first to avoid bishop e5 after d-pawn takes c5. Black is fine here. We can play f5, knight will go to c6. We just have to pay attention to the knight takes g5 trick. Finally, let's see our main topic, g3. We choose the c5 again. White has two main response, take it or play d5. d5 can come immediately or only after knight c6. We play the Benoni plan. Open the e-file for the rook, control the e5 square, and try to push b5. There are a few variations from here that can be found in the PGN. Let's look at an example. Knight d2 is typical in the Benoni. It will go to c4. h3 is the most common move. White stops our knight g4 e5 maneuver. a5 often isn't a good move to stop b5, because we play b5 anyway, and after the pawn exchange, the b2 could be weaker than the a6. Black has active position, and the plan is c4, knight to c5. So white castles first. Now d-pawn takes c5 leads to a more solid, symmetrical position, while d5 is the more exciting continuation. Bishop e3 could be a clever approach since we can't play b6 to protect the pawn due to the knight e5 threat, and our knight is pinned on the long diagonal. So we protect the c5 with the queen. White tries to eliminate our defender. Now with knight on a4, b6 is possible, and knight e5 is a blunder. We take the e5, and we'll win another piece for the rook. Occupy the d-file is better move. Black hasn't any problem. d5 is the critical. Knight b8 could be losing of tempos, so we go to a5 now, and this difference compared to a normal Benoni. White protects the c4 with knight, because b3 would have been met some threats on the long diagonal. Despite the knight is on a5, we continue with the usual e6, e-pawn takes d5 rook e8, and a6 b5 plan. I really like this kind of positions. Black has good winning chances, active pieces, and the concreter rook b8 b5 plan on the queenside. You can find the full PGN material on ChessGuin.com. The link is in the description.